morning, everybody. Hopefully, sound is good. All right. First, I just want to thank you to Denise explicitly for inviting me to be here today, and to the committee as well for asking me to come and share this presentation with you all today. Just a little bit about me, even though you already got a mouthful. As mentioned, I'm a member of the Pamunkey Indian tribe. Our community is located in King William County, Virginia, which is the Tidewater region of Virginia. We have a small 1,200-acre reservation that we have lived on since time immemorial, right? But established through treaty in 1646. And that's kind of my home base. That's where I'm from. In my professional life, I'm an anthropologist. And as mentioned in the bio, I approach my work through the lens of tribal historic preservation, focusing on cultural and natural resource management, right? Because natural resources, right, like the Chesapeake Bay and all that it holds are also cultural resources, especially not just to Indigenous communities, quite frankly, but to all of us. But I feel like there's a lot of decompartmentalization regarding the cultural aspects of the Bay and the management activities related to it that could be seen from a cultural lens as well, and that's kind of where my anthropological training comes in. So in particular today, I'm going to be talking about engaging Indigenous knowledge in the management of the Chesapeake Bay. This is a portion of a presentation that I gave to, I wrote it down so I don't get it wrong, to the Chesapeake Bay Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee, staff, several months ago. And as I mentioned, Denise asked me to come back and kind of reiterate some of the knowledge that I shared with the staff committee, many of you I know who are here today, and share it with you all. And hopefully to just kind of get folks thinking about the application of Indigenous knowledge and all of the activities, whether it's research, policy development, again, management activities of its resources, and thinking about how Indigenous peoples and communities can be engaged in that kind of work. Let's get started. Hopefully this will work. Okay. In particular, I'm going to be talking about the White House guidance on Indigenous knowledge that was basically put out to the public, in particular for federal agencies in December of 2022. But really, what's coming out of this guidance is much more applicable beyond just federal guidance and for federal agencies. Of course, federal, research projects being engaged in the Bay, but I know we have many more folks represented, at least here today especially, that aren't just related to a federal agency and are doing work that I think could benefit from the guidance that has come down from the White House. And the three tenets that I'm going to be talking about in the guidance include understanding Indigenous knowledge. So what is that? What is Indigenous knowledge? Why does it matter? Building mutually beneficial relationships with Indigenous communities. And then also looking to consider, to include, and to apply Indigenous knowledge in research, policy making, and management. And I'm going to provide some of my course own experience. As I already mentioned, I'm from Virginia. This is in Indigenous communities in Virginia is what I know best. So I'm going to be providing some kind of examples and observations that I've witnessed on what not to do, right? Which we have learned from, and some recommendations on what we can do. And what you all can do to start thinking about including Indigenous peoples and knowledge and the work that you all potentially do across the work in the Bay. I thought I got rid of all of the animation there, sorry, but the recommendations. I am technologically black thumb, so bear with me. If this presentation craps out on me in the middle of it, but I've got my script, so we'll be good. Okay. So understanding Indigenous knowledge, what is it? So according to, again, the White House guidance, it's a body of observations, oral and written knowledge, innovations, practices, and beliefs that were developed and implemented by tribes and Indigenous people, right, over a very long period of time, right? Each tribe has its own place-based body of knowledge that is kind of unique to them, and that's important to understand, right? I feel like, especially for folks who are not used to engaging with Indigenous peoples, we tend to take our perceptions of Indians, right, from Hollywood or from stereotypical perspectives, which is very much a monolith of what indigeneity looks like. And so that's why it's important to understand that each tribe has its own sense and practice of knowledge tied to its traditions, its history, culture, ancestors, etc. And importantly, Indigenous knowledge should be considered a valid form of evidence when we're talking about, again, research, policy development, decision making, when it comes to our natural environmental resources as well. Now, two key things that, in my opinion, were not really outlined in the guidance that I want to highlight today. Indigenous knowledge is also about approach, right? There are Indigenous approaches to relationship and partnership building. Never go into an Indigenous community thinking that you know what they need, right? Or thinking that, hey, I know how to build this relationship. You need to go in with kind of a blank slate in terms of expectations, right? So, and you need to take guidance from these communities and how they themselves think about partnership building and relationship building and what it means to them. It's also about the approach in sharing and protecting knowledge as well. This is something that needs to be considered and taken seriously and should be listened to, right? The approach to sharing knowledge, the approach to protecting that knowledge, data sovereignty, right? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that throughout the presentation. Needs to be considered from an Indigenous perspective. That is also a point of Indigenous knowledge. Again, there is also Indigenous approaches to the management of their cultural, natural, and environmental resources that all of us can learn from. I feel like, again, there is this, and it's, I'm putting a blanket statement on it myself, but I feel like, again, there's this approach to, they don't, I've got the expertise, I've got the scientific background, I'm the one, with the experience that can come in and give something. When actually, really, it's the other way around too, right? That's where the mutual benefit comes from, the mutually beneficial relationship. And just a quick note, I have an image here of the Mattaponi fish hatchery that's located on the Mattaponi Indian Reservation. The Pamunkey also have a fish hatchery as well. In particular, they're focused on shad fish. We've been operating those hatcheries for over a century. And they were developed, actually some of the first hatcheries in the state of Virginia, based off of Indigenous observations of the shad population that other folks weren't really paying any attention to because it was a part of our livelihood. Not just in terms of something that we needed to eat, but it's what we also engaged with to make money, right? We were heavily engaged in the shad market. And so in order to support that, not only ourselves, but the population itself, we established fish hatcheries that have been running in practice, like I said, for over a century. And the state of Virginia actually in the early 20th century looked to the tribes for support in helping the shad population. So there are examples, not just even recently, but over the last century, where there has been engagement with Indigenous knowledge to help support, in this case, for example, a particular species. The other point that I want to highlight too is that Indigenous knowledge is also tied to tribal sovereignty, right? Tribes are nations. They're not stakeholders, they're nations. As I mentioned, with their own practices when it comes to the management of cultural and natural resources. They have their own forms of governance. And so that's something that needs to be taken into account, especially when you are trying to build partnerships with Indigenous communities. They're not just there to provide knowledge, right? They are there to actually be contributors and partners in the knowledge building. And importantly, sharing knowledge from an Indigenous community should be seen as an expression of tribal sovereignty, right? So they need to have a concerted benefit and why the knowledge is being shared. they need to have a form of control in terms of how the knowledge is going to be shared, and I'll talk more about that shortly. So just a quick, guide over the things that I've observed in the Chesapeake Bay. But before I get into this, I do want to put out a disclaimer. These are some of the things not to do that I've observed just in my own work with tribal communities, with federal agencies, state agencies, and organizations, right? But I want to disclaim that there are definitely really wonderful examples that exist out there, right? And that we're all we're trying to work together to figure this out. I didn't mention at the top, but there are 7 newly federally recognized tribes in the state of Virginia who are kind of getting their administrative legs underneath them, and wanting to do this type of work from a different perspective, of wanting to partner with institutions, with agencies, et cetera, and organizations, but just haven't had the capacity to really engage in that as they're trying to build up their governance and administration capacity. And so I just want to highlight that there are good examples where tribes and different organizations, I'm just going to mention one off the top of my head, it's not the only. The Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences is doing some good work across the different departments there and working with tribal communities to, again, build mutually beneficial projects and programs that are going to serve the community. And talking about service, actually, that is the approach that my firm takes when it comes to working with Indigenous communities. It's about deference and it's about service to Indigenous communities. It's not just about, taking and utilizing Indigenous knowledge. It's about using our relationships with Indigenous communities to connect them to organizations and institutions, again, so that they can build programs that are going to benefit both parties. So again, these are the observations that I've kind of made just in my work over the last 20 years on what not to do. Especially which is in the last decade, there has been an increased push and interest to work with tribal communities and work and engage with Indigenous knowledge. The observations that I've made to kind of avoid or to really think deeply about is Indigenous knowledge isn't just a data point. Right? I see a lot of this where it's like, oh, I have a project that I want to do. I want to study, I'm just going to bring up shad again, this type of anadromous fish. And I really want to talk to some tribal elders about their observations because the grant program that I'm applying for says that I have to include Indigenous knowledge in some way, shape, or form. That's not engaging Indigenous knowledge, right? It's not just a data point. It's not just about research. Yes, that is a component, but I'm seeing kind of an overwhelming treatment of just Indigenous knowledge as a data point and not thinking about Indigenous knowledge as tribal sovereignty and in terms of relationship building. The benefit to the tribe is typically not considered or it's assumed, right? Again, without concerted discussion with tribal communities or building the program in partnership or the research in partnership with tribal communities, which is the third point. Tribal capacity challenges are not considered. As I mentioned, just in Virginia alone, we have 11 recognized tribes, 7 of them are federally recognized, 4 of them are state recognized, and they are dealing with serious capacity challenges. What I mean by that is funding, staff, etc. They're drinking from a fire hose right now, trying to build, again, their governance and administration. And so when a tribe is approached, for example, by a potential partner, a research partner, wanting to do work, let's say the project itself sounds awesome, right? But it's a multi-million-dollar project. It's going to benefit the community, but it was not approached through understanding the capacity challenges that a tribe has. So here, we're going to hand you this money, but we didn't consider that you actually need to pay people to manage the grant or the project, right? I was like, did I do something? So that's something that needs to be considered that I'm seeing, a challenge with in terms of organizations wanting to work with tribal communities. And then the other thing I've seen is that and I've seen this especially with federal agencies, they are referencing public data to develop projects and programs, right, on a specific tribal community or tribal communities. But the data that they're referencing was not developed in concert with the tribal partners that they're wanting to work with. And so that data doesn't necessarily reflect tribal community needs. And it's skewing the project or the program in a way that, again, is not going to really benefit the tribe the way that they need it to benefit them. So these are just things to kind of like mull on and think about when you're wanting to potentially start down the road of engaging Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous people. All of the things I mentioned, again, I know that 99% of this is coming from good intentions, right? But we have to recognize that especially when Indigenous knowledge is looked at from a data point, that's coming from a place of extraction. We have to be honest with ourselves about that. It is not considering the mutual benefits, these observations. And really, to engage Indigenous knowledge, you have to build trust. And that's where the relationship building comes in. So, to the next federal guidance, here is growing and maintaining mutually beneficial relationships. This is a must. Before, again, you even are going to consider Indigenous knowledge as a data point, this has to happen first. So, considering and applying Indigenous knowledge, as I mentioned, is going to take the time and resources to build those mutually beneficial relationships. Because how are you going to build mutual benefits if you don't really understand what the priorities and the needs are within that community? You want to pursue opportunities that provide direct funding or other means of support to an Indigenous community partner that you're wanting to work with. I know in some ways that should go without saying, but maybe hopefully y'all would be shocked at the amount of times that I have seen funding for Indigenous engagement not present at all. And that's just not acceptable, right? Indigenous people are there to provide perspective and expertise, and they should be compensated for that expertise and the time that they're taking to provide it. Consider Indigenous-led approaches, right, to research, to initiatives, and other actions that include Indigenous knowledge, right? So again, don't just come in with the assumption that, hey, I've got everything laid out here. I know what I'm doing. I know what's needed. Think about how the Indigenous community would want X, Y, and Z to happen, right? And that's, again, where the crux of building that relationship is so important, because you're not going to know that until you start those conversations. So some things to think about when you are building wanting to build those relationships with Indigenous communities is to commit time and resources, right? Working with Indigenous communities at the level that is required takes a lot of time, okay? And it takes a lot of resources. And when I mean resources, I mean like man hours, as I mentioned, time, and then again, funding the folks who are engaging in that work, which is the next point, on tribal engagement and relationship building. For example, and this is not to throw anybody under the bus, it's just an example. I do a lot of work with the National Park Service, which I'm very honored and happy to be able to do, working at one particular Indigenous site. And we work with 7 tribal partners on that work together. The site is known as Rural Wacomico. Some of you might or might not have heard of it, located off the York River in Gloucester County, Virginia. But I've had to consistently remind them that when they do their budgets for this type of contract work that is supposed to be coming at a co-stewardship, co-management approach to working with tribal communities, they don't include the funding for the actual talking to tribal nations. So it's a learning experience. I think that's part of why I'm here today too, to have this presentation and hopefully a conversation with folks after this is over. So that we kind of learn together on kind of what to do and what not to do. Provide opportunities for capacity building, right? So that's not just funding, but think about how your project can actually work directly with tribal youth or with tribal elders to train them up on the skills, right, that might be engaged in the work that you're wanting to do with them. That's just one example. Because there's a lot of Indigenous folks who are interested in doing the kind of work that's happening with the Bay, but they just don't have the experience. Or maybe they don't have the resources to engage how to get trained or educated on something. So that's another thing to think about, right? Capacity building, not just in terms of money, but in terms of your sharing of your knowledge, right? In a way that the tribes can actually take in and utilize within their own communities so that they don't always have to go to the outside, right? To get the expertise and the knowledge that they need. And then I was going to go to the next thing. Okay, so ensure protections for Indigenous knowledge. Free, prior, and informed consent. So basically what I mean by that is Indigenous people need to have a full understanding and provide consent based off of that full understanding of how their knowledge, especially as a data point, is going to be incorporated, utilized, and disseminated, right? Without that free, prior, informed consent of sharing of that knowledge, then we're going to have a problem with the project. And this leads into the next point of Indigenous data sovereignty or Indigenous data governance, where, again, treating it just as a data point does not provide the control that is required when we're talking about Indigenous data sovereignty. So this is, again, it goes back to the start, building those relationships. You want to have a program, you want to have a project, how it's going to be mutually beneficial. Well, part of that in building that trust is ensuring that the tribes have some kind of say and control in how their data is going to be collected, how it's going to be utilized, how it's going to be published, how it's going to be interpreted, and where is it going to sit, right? How it's going to be managed. So these are all things that you want to think about and consider. And they should be considered, again, in consultation with the tribal communities you're wanting to work or with. Ask, where can the relationship intersect at a mutually beneficial place? Okay, so these are the questions you want to think about. How can I work in a way that incorporates Indigenous-led processes, right? So I'm not just going to come in with my one specific process that I learned, which is useful and should be a part, but how can you engage and incorporate that with an Indigenous way of doing the similar activity, right, or their similar management project? How is this project that I'm wanting to work on going to serve the Indigenous community? Going back to that kind of approach of service-based research. How is this going to serve and benefit the community? You need to be able to answer that question. And how, again, is this going to aid in capacity building? These are kind of the three main tenets that we push on our non-tribal clients when they're wanting to do tribal engagement. These are the types of things that you need to consider. So applying Indigenous knowledge. Again, we can talk about this in many different contexts, but of course, given the audience, we're going to talk about that within the Chesapeake Bay. You want to first recognize, I'm going to repeat some things because I just feel like it's important to do that, especially in this context of this conversation. Recognize that tribes are sovereign nations, right? They're not stakeholders. Stakeholder can be a dirty word in a tribal community, okay? So just keep that in mind. Recognize that tribes practice their own stewardship and management activities that, again, are coming from their own approach and understanding. That tribes are also invested in the Bay's management and resiliency. They just, again, don't necessarily have the capacity and the resources to engage in it in the way that they would like to, which is why the partnership and relationship building with folks like you in this room are really important. They are not just points of data, right, to be extracted, and needs to go, before you even get to that point, you've got to start that trust building and that relationship building. And that kind of getting back to the sovereign nations point, that they should be considered as equal partners and equitable partners in the Bay's management and resiliency. And so some just, quick recommendations for implementing guidance the White House guidance that I've kind of outlined here today, where we're kind of in the third point now, the third tenet of that guidance. It's like, okay, how are we going to apply this to research, to policy making, to management, right? It's going to look different in many different ways, but think about the Bay, right, like I said, and its many resources as a cultural resource in addition to a natural resource. And think about how you can approach working within the Bay from a co-stewardship or co-management perspective, right? Where again, Indigenous communities and other communities, right, stakeholder communities are seen as equitable and equal partners in that management and that stewardship. One of the things that I did definitely bring up in the staff committee, and it might be, I think it's probably applicable to several folks here in this room, or at least for the organizations or agencies or whatever that you guys are representing, is consider official tribal representation in those organizations, right? As I mentioned, tribes are sovereign nations. There's a lot of interstate agreements, right, or coalitions or agreements that are being made that do not address Indigenous communities or concerns or look at them in the same light as a state, right? Like I said, they're a sovereign nation. They technically are kind of on the same level as the state here, and that's not being perceived, I think, in this region. I've actually seen, quite frankly, some pushback on considering tribes having more official representation that, you know, the governor of Virginia, for example, has on certain committees or bodies, organizing bodies that are making the decisions, right, regarding Bay management and resiliency efforts. So for the folks who might have power, think about having official tribal representation at the top level, rather than, again, just at the data point. Not saying that the data point is bad or low, it's just, again, before you get there, you should probably start here. So that's something to consider. Start your relationship building. I mentioned already, I know that there are folks in this room who are already doing good work, right? So network with one another about what has worked, what hasn't worked in your own efforts, you know, if those are taking place. But go ahead and start those relationship building opportunities. And really, it's not, I say this to my clients all the time, it's not rocket science. I know it can be kind of daunting, but commit time and resources, number one. Know that this is something that's going to take time, it's going to take money. Be patient. Because, for example, you know, you can have a project, you can, let's say, do outreach to, I've been in projects where we've done outreach to 33 tribes for a particular program. We only hear back from 5. Guess what? That's awesome. You know what I mean? And keep that door of communication open, right? Kind of keep that hand out for that relationship building, because maybe the only 5 came within that initial phase of outreach, but a year, 2, 3 years down the line, as you're building your program, 5 other tribes want to engage and kind of start, you know, being a part of that initiative. So be patient, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not something that's going to be able to serve every single tribal community that's represented in the region, right, or an area. But working with one is better than working with none. And working with that one, right, is going to help you build a model for engaging beyond just the one. So, you know, don't think that that's necessarily a negative start, only being able to work with 1 or 2 tribes at a time. One thing that I recommend, again, to my organizational clients is look at your organization internally. What do you already have that's going on regarding engagement with Indigenous communities? Again, where is that working? Where is it not working? Where are the intersections that you can see within your organization, because you know it better, right, than anybody else? Where do I see the intersections in my organization where I feel like it's going to engage with Indigenous history, culture, knowledge, resource management, etc. And that's kind of where you can, that's the foundation you can start on for starting to have conversations and build those relationships. The last point I have on here is the Chesapeake Coastal Resilience Tribal Alliance. So this is a project that I'm actually working with Denise on with the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, and we have several tribal partners that have signed on to actually build a tribal coalition or consortium around Chesapeake Bay issues, right? And so this, we're hoping, is going to be one of the spaces that folks like yourselves can go, right, to engage with tribal communities, because there's a lot of tribes that are represented in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And it can be daunting trying to get all of those folks kind of engaged in what you're trying to do. And having this alliance is kind of twofold, right? It's a capacity building project. The tribes are going to work better together when it comes to all of the outreach efforts that are starting to happen. And we can't respond to everything, right? And so having this alliance allows tribal communities to come in, have representation, right, at this bigger organizational level to help with making the decisions on whether or not we're going to engage in a project. And it's also providing, again, a space for other folks like yourselves in this room to go so that you know where to go, that it's going to be easier to communicate with all of the tribes represented in one entity and one organization than having to necessarily go out and talk to all 33 or however many that are going to pertain to your project. And we're also hoping to engage youth in this. Like I said, it's about capacity building. We want the youth to be engaged in this type of work so that if they're interested in pursuing something beyond, representation on a coalition, but actually wanting to get involved in the various fields that are represented here today, we can help build an avenue or a path for that through the Alliance. And we're also hoping, because of that pushback, right, of having that official representation at the higher level, well, when you have an alliance of like 15 plus tribes, it's real hard to say no to that official representation, right? So the alliance also makes it easier for that representation to happen whether people want it or not. And so I just want folks to know that this is something that is building. We're building momentum. We're hoping to get funding. Should be hearing back soon to actually fund this initiative. But it hopefully will also be there as a resource that we can get this funded and up and running for the folks here in this room as well. So I just want all of you to kind of be on the lookout for that. And also maybe think about ways that your organization, institution, or agency can support as well. So without further ado, I think that is the end of my presentation. So I don't know how much time I have left. We have time for questions. And okay, plenty of time. Perfect. I know I threw a lot of information at you guys, but I'm happy to answer questions, discuss anything. Don't be afraid to ask questions, I promise.
We have plenty of time for questions.
Hi, my dad's kind of related to that one. A lot of federal fund emails have care data principles.
Yep.
Are you aware of those and how do you feel about those?
Yeah, so the care principles are something actually we reference and utilize in our own work. I think they're definitely useful when you're trying to frame, again, an approach to Indigenous data governance. So there are several resources out there. I mean, literally, you just Google it, that take the care principles and apply them to Indigenous data governance. So I think they're useful, and they're definitely a resource that folks can look to.
Other questions?
Not. You mentioned Anna Menendez and Johns Hopkins. You mentioned the tribal, the cultural level interactions, but I'm wondering also about the class level interactions, because the history of the environmental movement in the U.S. is very fraught, both with Indigenous people, but also with the needs of working class people.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the intersection.
No, that's a really good question, and it ties to Indigenous knowledge, definitely, because, okay, so take the bay and its resources. Obviously, Indigenous peoples of the Chesapeake Bay were, engaging in the management of the bay well before Europeans ever arrived, right? And when Europeans do arrive, they bring the concept of market economy and capitalism. We do what we do best. We adapt and we pivot and we take our traditional skills and knowledge and we pivot those, right, to benefit our communities. And that utilization of the watershed and the bay was no different, right? And so what I'm trying to get at is that our people were also working class related to the bay. And this goes back to the shad, right, like helping to manage the shad population. So very much the Indigenous peoples, the bay have been involved in looking at and understanding like species management because it was a matter of survival for them. And then implementing efforts to do that. The class situation where we get engaged, I guess involved too, is it's not even just about the class situation too, right? We've got the class issue, the working class, they are watermen, like that is their primary way of getting cash into their households. But it's also about treaty rights. This is where the kind of sovereign nation thing is really at play here too. Part of the treaty rights that were at least established in Virginia stated that we had basically free reign of hunting, fishing, gathering, oystering, etc., right, throughout Virginia or our territories. And that means, from our perspective, that we don't have to follow certain laws, right, attached to that, that I know folks with the working class, right, have been fighting against too. It's like there needs to be this fine balance between I need to feed my family, but I also recognize that I need the species in order to feed my family. And honestly, quite frankly, I mean, I feel like the working class folks are just as knowledgeable in terms of being able to support the knowledge about the management, right, of these resources and should be engaged. And the Indigenous community happens to intersect both of those things, right? So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but hopefully I kind of touched on what you were getting at.
Other questions?
Question / statement, and maybe just kind of still elaborate on. One of the, kind of concerns, issues I have is, more on the federal level of, with getting grants to do projects. And there's, has been this push for meaningful engagement, across on many categories, whether it's environmental justice communities, whether it's Indigenous, but grant phases haven't been extended. So you still get like a 2-year grant, and that's not enough time to do meaningful engagement. So it's kind of been hard to like incorporate these strategies into projects because there's still that like time crunch. And I'm hoping in the future, like if we want to do this meaningful engagement, then there's going to have to be some changes in like the grant process. And I don't know, like, where, when, or where, because there's this push to do it, but the timing hasn't changed.
You're bringing up a really good point about this guidance, but the guidance not making it down to like the weeds, right? So yeah, like granting situations where it's like we're being asked to do these things, but we're not being given the funding and the time necessary to really do it. At least as the guidance states that it should be done. This is where, again, the issue is that the guidance states that it's not just about, again, the data point, it's about using Indigenous knowledge for the changing of policy and for decision making. That's not happening really, because if the federal government were, and of course I'm biased as an Indigenous person with the federal government, the federal government really wanted to make it easy, so to speak, for this guy guidance to be implemented, they would have everything else kind of catch up, like the granting or portion of things, and it just hasn't.
I'm just saying, like, you know, currently have a 2-year grant, and it's impossible to then incorporate some meaningful engagement.
Right. And so
it's impossible.
you can do something and you can provide feedback to that granting agency, right? To say like, you're asking me to do this, but if I'm going to do it the way that I know it needs to be done, it's not possible. One of the ways that we've been able to get around this, and it's not possible for every grant opportunity, is we actually we recommend our clients actually start with phasing their projects. And that first phase, where it's funded in multiple phases, and that first phase is the outreach and engagement, to actually like, okay, we've got an idea, we've done our initial outreach, we have folks who are interested, let's get funding to actually really support the program development side of things. That's phase 1, and then we're going to get more funding to actually do the implementation of that. So instead of 2 years, you have 4 years, right? But that's not necessarily always possible. And so I recommend trying to be strategic, right, with the grants that are opportunities that are available. Be vocal about the challenges that you're seeing, right, on the ground regarding what you're being told to do, but with not the time or funding necessary to really do it. So, and you know, that's the other thing, like we as Indigenous people also need to be vocal about, okay, you're asking for all of these organizations and agencies to do this, but we're not seeing the benefit of that because you're not catching up with the policy or the decision making around, for example, like grant funding, grant programming. That's a great point because it's reality. I appreciate you bringing that up.
Any other questions for Ashley?
Actually, Kathy Boomer with staff at the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. Thank you so much for sharing. I wanted to explore or ask if you could help us understand, you highlighted applying Indigenous processes and not looking to collect data or seeing tribal nations as a data point. Can you help us understand the processes a little bit more and maybe spark ideas about what we, the broader, the full Chesapeake Bay community could think about in better managing our resources?
Yes, that's a good question. And I think it's going to vary from context to context, right, about what a approach or a process looks like, right? But, you know, for example, I'm going to go back to the shad because I brought it up. But again, there have been Indigenous ways over hundreds of years of kind of like understanding how the population has been working within, right, their particular environment that they've engaged in. So, for example, the Pamunkey River, right? And so it's not, when I'm talking about Indigenous-led approaches, it's like, okay, hey, I want to work with Pamunkey on, you know, I'm making things up, so bear with me, a species recovery grant regarding the American shad. I know I have my scientific approach to how I understand the species and maybe the issues that are contributing to its decline here on the East Coast, right? But I'm not going to assume that that is the only approach. I'm going to work with the tribal fishermen, watermen, on how they approach their observations and understanding of this species, and I'm going to meld those things together, right? So it's just understanding, like, what are their observations, what is their understanding, even something as, it's not simple, but something as simple as like managing the actual animal itself, right? There might be approaches to that. And then I'm going to bring up like what I know best, which is anthropology and archaeology, right? I have a PhD in anthropology with a focus in archaeology. So I learned how to do archaeology from a scientific perspective, right, and approach. But that's not necessarily how Indigenous people approach the archaeological record, right? And so I'm taking what I know from my educated academic background and working with Indigenous people to understand, again, okay, what does this resource mean to me? How do I want to observe it? How do I want to interpret it? And how am I going to treat it? And really delve into how those things are happening from the Indigenous perspective. And again, melding those two things together, because that's the other thing. I feel like there's this false dichotomy of Indian people and scientists, right? I mean, yes, I'm not gonna lie, that does exist across Indigenous communities across the globe. But I know, at least from my perspective, from my own community, we are not against science. We're just against scientists not recognizing the fact that we have our own agenda, our own needs, our own priorities, and our own approaches that need to be melded with the scientific method, right? And again, it's back to finding those intersections. And it's starting from the beginning. It's about having those conversations to determine where those intersections lay and melding them together to benefit, again, what you're trying to do through your scientific work and what they're trying to do, not just through scientific work, but for, again, this is my made-up example, for species recovery or whatever, right? Hopefully that was helpful.
Right, thank you.
More questions? Comments? Us? Yes, Denise.
Actually, I'm just gonna make this really specific because it's the challenge. So ever since you came to staff, we're going, well, okay, what would tribal representation on staff look like? And you talk about, but it's a complicated landscape for somebody on the outside looking into 11 recognized, and those are just the recognized tribes, right? And then your comment about how unique each one is, right? It's diverse, it's not monolithic. So for example, if we wanted to have tribal representation on staff, how would I start? Is it problematic if I ask you from the Pamunkey and I haven't asked someone from the Mattaponi? Like, how do we start that in a respectful way?
Yeah, that's a great question, Denise. Thank you for bringing that up. I mentioned Indigenous knowledge in terms of approach. All of these tribes have basically an expected method of being approached regarding whatever project it is, whether it's official representation on TV or working with a university to do X, Y, and Z, right? And the main thing that I always tell people is that you start with tribal leadership, okay? You don't go to, hey, I know this person that says that they're Chickahominy, right? But they're not on the tribal government. You don't really know if they are truly representative of that tribal community. So you start, it's a chain of command. You start with tribal leadership. And what I mean by that is the chief. Now, if there are tribal communities that have environmental directors, which some of them do, right? It's a logical kind of chain of command. You're wanting to do staff, okay, let me reach out to the chiefs, and I'm gonna also CC that environmental director, right? Whoever's listed as handling kind of environmental or natural resource affairs for the tribe, to start that conversation. And yes, you need to reach out to every single one of them. That goes back to sovereign nation. They are their own governing systems, and so therefore each one of them needs to be appropriately addressed. So that's kind of the approach to it. And there's a big issue. I'm glad you asked this question because I didn't want to bring it up. There's a major issue with folks representing themselves as Indigenous people representing specific communities. And why I say that's an issue is because I'm not here to say that people aren't Indigenous or don't have Indigenous heritage, but if you are not a citizen of that nation, an enrolled citizen of that nation, and you do not have an official space or place or appointment within your nation, then that you are not the representative. Tribes have the sovereign right to determine who is representing them. For example, would Germany represent the United States? No, right? So it's kind of like that mentality. It's just, like when I said it's not rocket science, it's just, there is a logical way to think about it. Even if you don't know how the tribe approaches it, just know that I'm gonna start with the chief and the appropriate staff if they exist. And then be patient.
Any other questions? We have 5 seconds.
So this is actually the follow-up to Lisa's question, because I hear you saying, yes, you have to talk to all of those. And I'm wondering, you said there's some things like the Alliance, and I spoke with a gentleman at PPA who works as a liaison to a council
Yes.
of multiple tribes. Would that maybe be a better entry point, is to go try to, engage with, these councils or the leadership of an alliance?
That's a great question. So if there is a council, right, and I know exactly which council, the Region 3, there's a title for it, and I can't think of it. And Brian Hamilton is the tribal liaison of the EPA. The appropriate thing to do when you're doing something is, for example, official representation on a committee like STAC, right? Or, I can't think of anything else, but you know what I mean? Like an official entity that has state representation. You want to go to the source, which is the direct tribal government, right? There's nothing wrong with doing follow-up with the council, right? Or with the alliance, if it's something like that, for example. And one of the things in terms of like a council or an alliance, the hope too is that they're very clear about their purpose and their mission. So okay, they represent X, Y, and Z for these tribes. So I can reach out to them about this. But when it comes to like, again, that official representation at that nation level, you've got to start with the tribal government.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. If not, then we'll go ahead and go to break, and thank you, Ashley.
Yes, thank you.